But I think it's time we do something a little bit more fun, because we have the absolute pleasure. I'm so excited to bring on the lead developer for WoW Classic. It is Brian Birmingham. This is amazing. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Nice to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so as I said, this is the lead developer. Brian, please introduce yourself. Let us know how long you've been in the team and things like that.
Yeah, I'm Brian Birmingham. I'm the lead software engineer on the World of Warcraft Classic team. I'm one of two leads now, and we share responsibilities. I've been on the Classic team since 2019, really 2018 when we were developing it. So since the very beginning of the Classic team. I've been on the World of Warcraft team since 2006. I joined midway through patch 110 or so. And I've been doing that since then. I took about 3 years where I was working on Hearthstone. That was a lot of fun. And then I came back from Hearthstone to lead WoW Classic.
That's amazing. So we've only got a limited amount of time with you, Brian. So we're going to jump right into this. We're going to ask you some questions today for the community and for everyone else. Question 1, Brian. What is something specifically that you've worked on in Wrath of the Lich King that is going to be launching in an hour and a bit, that you are proud of?
It's hard. This is a hard question because, as a team lead, I end up not working directly on a lot of things, but I work overall seeing a lot of things. And so I think the thing that is most exciting, as a kind of a team accomplishment for me, is Wintergrasp, because it's one of those things that was a real challenge for us, trying to figure out how we would bring back that original feeling of Wintergrasp in a different world than that we're living in today, in a world where there are layers. And where, at the time that we were developing it, a lot of the realms were really kind of lopsided in terms of their faction balance. And so we wanted to make sure that we had something that would feel like a good experience that, made people remember what it was like to be back in Wintergrasp, back in the original days, and still felt like it was something that you could compete in, even if you were maybe the underdog on your faction, or excuse me, on your realm, and have some way to understand, what does it mean to have won Wintergrasp and have access to those resources like the Vault of Archimon, in a world where there are multiple layers. And so what we decided to do that I'm really happy about is we spin it up like a battleground, but it's like a massive battleground, like an epic battleground. We're for launch going to start with 3 raid groups on each side. So 120 versus 120 is what it'll fill up to. And and then there'll be match made across the entire region so that you can, be reasonably confident you can get a match quickly. And then if you win in that match and come back to your realm, you give your entire faction access to all of the rewards of winning Wintergrasp. So that way there's the capability of having that kind of feeling of, I really want to go out and do this thing, or, I'm so glad my friend did this thing. I'm so glad that our faction has access to Vault of Archimon tonight, whether or not I participated. But if you're having a hard time getting access to it, there's an action you can take. You can be like, let's get together a raid group. Let's go in and try to win one of these things. And so you can kind of focus your effort on that. And there's still going to be that 3-hour timer. We've got it locked to be every 3 hours on the hours is when there'll be a 30-minute period when you can join. So that kind of brings back that feeling of, we're going to control it for a period of time. How long? About 3 hours.
That's amazing.
It's very accessible. Question 2, is there going to be class balancing regularly throughout the tiers, kind of akin to retail?
That's a good question, and I would say not really the same as retail, or we like to call it modern. And so I will say we will pay attention to see if there's anything that's really, particularly egregious, and we might be willing to make some adjustments. But in general, we're pretty hands off. We don't want to have that same kind of day-to-day tuning that modern WoW has to try to make sure that everybody's exactly balanced. We want it to be a little bit more of a, this is what it was, this is what we've recreated, what are your cool tips and tricks for how you could approach that, and let people try to figure those out on their own. We do feel like we did a pretty good job of picking the final patch for the class balance to go with, so that at that point we have kind of encapsulated all of the bug fixes and balance changes that the original designers made throughout the expansion, as they were kind of learning how new talents and abilities would play with one another. And then by the end, they're relatively locked in as this is where the balance ought to be. And so we feel like going with those as the initial talent distribution is a good way to start, and then we are unlikely to have to make a lot of changes as we go.
And to clarify, that means things like Launch Death Knight, which is renowned for being, we'll say, a menace in PvP, is not going to be so much so.
Correct. Actually, we talked about that a little bit. There's a video, I think, going around with Tom Chilton and Chris Zerhut talking about how, like, when they originally released the Death Knight, they kind of almost on purpose made it a little bit too powerful because it was the new class, right? They wanted it to be like, it's fun to play, it's something exciting. I don't feel bad that I left my other class behind, but at the same time, it was a lot of like, hey, this thing seems really crazy. I'm not sure what players are going to do with it. Let's see. And then when they saw it, they said, okay, this needs to come down a little bit. This needs to come down a little. This needs to be reworked. But by and large, it still feels like that original Wrath of the Lich King Death Knight. You've still got that ability to play like any of the 3 specs as a tank or a DPS, right? Like you can do that in any of them. And that feels really good and really cool. And is very distinct from the modern version of the Death Knight, where they've really focused on, blood as the tanking spec. You can tank in Frost or Unholy if you want. That's a valid strategy. And even like the tanking presence is Frost presence back in Wrath of the Lich King. So yeah, it still feels like a Wrath of the Lich King, even though it is a little more balanced than it was at initial launch in 2008.
You're giving me actual goosebumps reliving that moment all those years ago. And is it 14 years ago that we first set foot? Which is just a crazy thought to think. So, coming up next, how do you and your team, the Classic team, feel about the gear disparity between PvE and PvP? And what I mean with that is we've heard that 10-man gear will be buffed and dropped into 5-man content, if I'm correct, in the later phases.
A little different than that. It's not so much that it's going to be... Oh, I think I see what you mean. But what our current plan is, and we are really looking for feedback on this, but what we're currently thinking is when Ulduar comes out, so that's months from now, but when Ulduar comes out, we're thinking that the Naxxramas 10-person instance should drop the 25-player loot at that time.
Right.
So that if you're running Ulduar to get your top-tier loot, you still have something that feels a little bit closer than like the 10-man is 2 tiers below, basically, at that point. So we want to make sure that if you're running like 10-person pugs of Naxxramas, it still feels like it's valuable even while Ulduar is out, if that makes sense.
It does.
That said, of course, the 10-player loot being 25-player Naxxramas loot will still be not as good as the Ulduar loot. And then we need to put that 10-player Naxxramas loot somewhere. We want people who are like looking for a specific piece they want to still have opportunities to go get it. And so we're thinking that we will move that into the heroic modes as like a advanced difficulty heroic, some kind of like a heroic plus or something like that, but something that's kind of an optional difficulty that you can turn on, similar to maybe the Ulduar hard modes that you could unlock, or similar to like the Encourage revamped difficulties we did with Season of Mastery, for anybody who's familiar with those. In that one, there was an object at the beginning of Encourage where you could go over to and interact with it, and if you were interacting with it, you could tell it that you wanted to, turn up the difficulty, and there was a kind of a thematic, how mad are you going, how much are you staring into the eyes, do you see like claws and tentacles, and then those things would show up on the raid encounter. So we're looking to do something a little bit like that. I don't want to overpromise, but that's to kind of give the context of what we're thinking. And so then, as that relates to PvP gear, the PvP gear is generally balanced around the top tier raid content. So around Ulduar, it'll be tuned around Ulduar. I think the concern about PvP versus PvE gear comes from a different announcement that we're considering reintroducing pre-nerf Ulduar. We have said in the past we weren't going to do pre-nerf raids for Wrath of the Lich King, but then players pointed out but Ulduar was nerfed. It was mostly because most of them weren't nerfed that much, right?
Did they nerf pounds?
Say again?
It was a meme from the original Ulduar. Ironaya, all her cats would pounce the main thing instantly.
My gosh.
So did they nerf pounce?
I honestly can't remember the specific ones, but we were going through them and we were talking to actually Ian Hazacostas had worked on the raids at the time, and we was talking about some of the nerfs that happened. So it was in conversations with the community and with him. We were like, actually some of these we should bring back. Ulduar in particular does have a pre-nerf version that would be worth trying to restore. And so we're thinking about doing that, and possibly doing that in combination with buffing the loot from Ulduar also. Like, if we're going to make it harder, maybe we should make the rewards better. And that's where people go whoa, what about the balance against the PvP gear? And so we're going to look at that and make sure that if we do decide to increase the PvE gear, we'll make sure that it feels like it's equivalent. It's entirely possible that it will still fit, depending on what the adjustments are, or we may need to make adjustments to the PvP gear. But we are aware of that disparity. We don't want people to feel like, I have to go to the raid in order to PvP competitively, or I have to PvP in order to raid competitively. But we do also want people to feel like, I could raid, and bring some of those pieces and have them be useful in PvP, and I could PvP and have people have those pieces be useful in raiding. So we want there to be a little bit of cross balance, but still for you to feel like the best stuff comes from the activity that you like.
All right, question 4. What are your thoughts personally on the new LFG system? Has it worked, and does it need improvement?
I think it's broadly worked for what we're expecting from it. And does it need improvements? Of course, everything always does. And so we're definitely getting feedback from people who are expressing like specific concerns. And that's, to be clear, the most useful feedback is when people can tell us, this is the problem that I'm having with it. This is what I'm trying to do. And this is what I'm having trouble doing. Then we can focus in on that feedback and say, okay, well, where's that problem coming from? How can we improve that? What is the issue there? But broadly, we're happy with the fact that people have been able to use it to form natural groups. People are able to like have conversations with people and make groups. It's not as quick as an automatic group finder would be. We know that. We knew that going in. So that is really kind of the expectation, is that there is more effort put into forming a group so that the group feels sticky. That's actually by design. We want that to be the case.
And is that the social experience that drives that? Is that what you're trying to capture?
It's part of a theory of friendship formation, that you want to have these repeat serendipitous interactions with people and then have them built on each other over and over again. So when you're in a smaller realm, like smaller than a mega realm, but still a healthy sized realm, right? You tend to see the same people in Group Finder over and over again, or the same people out in the world over and over again. And when you see the same person, that's how that bond first starts. Those friendships form from that beginning point when you're first seeing, just like, oh, I remember, I think I saw that guy yesterday. I didn't talk to him at all, but today I see that it's the same person. And so then maybe I'll talk to him today, or maybe not. But then the next time and the next time and the next time, that's what causes you to have a new friendship form, is when you see people over and over again and you slowly build that confidence. And having a group finder tool that is locked to your realm and doesn't do automatic teleportation and has you have conversations with people about what their role is, what the goal of your dungeon group is going to be. Like, are you going to be new player friendly? Are you going to try to burn super fast? Are you going to try to speed level? Is that the goal? Or are you going to be like, no, we just want to like take our time and have a good time in here? And that kind of helps people all come to the dungeon with the same expectation. And I have a personal example of that I had, where I invited somebody to the group. He was a warrior, and so I started in my mind, I'm like filing him away. It's like, okay, maybe this guy can tank. And then as we're starting to form the group, I was like, and are you going to tank? And he was like, I wasn't gonna. I'm DPS spec'd. And I was like, oh, it's okay. Like, we're all going to be fine with that. Like, we don't want to keep waiting for somebody else who's protection spec'd. It's okay. And he was like, well, all right, as long as everybody's okay with it. And it was like, yeah, we're all cool. And then he was a great tank. He was fantastic. But there's that nervousness that people want to overcome, that you can, like, when you're having a conversation with them, you can tell them, like, yeah, it's okay. We don't need you to be an A+ amazing over the top tank, even though he was. But we will be accepting and work with you to try to get through this dungeon together.
So, is this something, you said it's not perfect yet, and nothing ever is, which I completely agree with. Sure. Is it something you will consider looking at down the line, adjustments or changing? When right now, obviously, there's a trillion people excited in queue to play this, but servers may die down, population may die, and these queues may grow. Are you open to changing in the future? Are you open to opening it up a little bit?
Potentially. We've been talking about some of the things that we might do and where they lead. And so far, we haven't found any kind of opening up solution in terms of, like, some people have suggested, we've seen suggestions, for example, from the community, like, what if you allowed cross-realm grouping? And, like, I've talked a little bit already about how, like, we think that actually, like, it makes the pool of players larger, reduces the number of repeat interactions with the same people, so we're concerned about that in particular. But also that if you allow that for some kind of groups, is some of the suggestions, then eventually people start to say, like, well, why can't I have it for this group? Or it causes an awkward interaction where, because you're trying to allow cross-server for one activity, it makes it feel like weird that you see them in your party, but they're not really with you. So there's lots of, like, knock-on effects where every time we look at one of these, we often go, there's a problem that is an unintended consequence of doing this. So we're not unwilling to consider future changes, but so far we haven't found any that we like. And And the kind of thing we're looking at is more like various UI tweaks. There was a bug on launch, for example, where like I think it was marking everybody as defaulting to tank.
Yeah.
And it was like every time you logged out, or I think every time you changed zone or something like that, it was something like that, where there was like a message between servers on the back end of the realm where, they were missing a flag. It would force flag you to tank. But yeah, we figured that bug out. We fixed that. And we're looking for things like that, of course, any bug fixes, or also just, usability improvements.
Okay. So, time for a big question here, Brian. A couple of days ago... Get ready. A couple of days ago, something came out with an interview with a very good friend of mine, Mr. GM, and that was Heroic Plus. Can you talk to me a little bit more about the design philosophy behind it? Can you tell us a little bit more? Is it just going to be numbers? Can we expect affixes? Can we expect mechanical changes? Can you give us anything more on Heroic Plus?
We have talked about that a little bit already, and I'm happy to go into more depth. It is still in design, so it's not finished. I can't talk about it concretely yet. Yes. But what I can say is it is motivated by that desire to have the 10-player raids drop the 25-player loot when they're not the current tier. So once again, just for anybody who's joining us now, that's when Ulduar comes out, we're going to go to Naxxramas and have Naxxramas 10-player drop the 25-player loot. That way, if you're still running Ulduar and you want to do pickup groups that are 10-player, you feel like they're still kind of worth your time, if that makes sense. And then having done that, we wondered, well, where do we put the 10-player loot? And the 10-player loot from Naxxramas, where should that go? And we thought, what if we moved it to the Heroics and gave it to you with a little bit of additional challenge, so you could kind of tune the Heroics up a little bit and make them more challenging. We definitely would increase the numbers, but we're also talking about whether we would do some kind of other thematic mechanical changes. And so just to kind of like, an idea off the top of my head is maybe some of the Vrykul dungeons have like a little bit of extra frost damage or some kind of like a movement slow. And I'm just making this up right now. I don't know if that's what the designers are actually thinking, but they're thinking of something.
You said it so that they will expect it.
I'm waiting.
Another good example, but this one we probably almost certainly wouldn't do, but to give you an idea of like the kind of thematic changes we might do, is someone jokingly suggested once, hey, if we ever brought back the zombie plague, maybe we should bring it back by having anybody who gets the zombie plague in Calling of Stratholme come out and bring it out that way. Anyway, we're not planning to do that, but that was one of those things of like, oh, this is a kind of a fun thematic tie-in. So we would be looking for things that were thematic, felt like they fit with the dungeon, to try to add as an additional tweak to it. And that's kind of in line with what I mentioned before, like similar to what we did with Encourage and Season of Mastery, where we added some kind of like Cthulhu insanity kind of mechanics, where there were real tentacles and also fake tentacles and hallucinatory tentacles, and like, what are you doing about this? And so that kind of ties into that whole, Cthulhu insanity motif that's present in Encourage. And going forward, looking at the Wrath of the Lich King heroic dungeons, if we tune those up a little bit, we'll do the same kind of thing where we look for something thematic that fits.
So, Kat, I think you're next up with number 7 here.
So we're curious if there's going to be new achievements, timers, or even potentially leaderboards with the addition of Heroic Plus. Lots of competitive people out there.
That's a really good question. We probably aren't likely to do leaderboards, but it's possible. Like, we just haven't been talking about it. But new achievements seems totally like something that we should explore. I don't know off the top of my head, because again, like, this is something that's early design, right? Where it's a recent idea we had, and we're trying to figure out what we want to do with it. But I don't see any reason why achievements should be off the table. So I don't have any promises to make there, but it sounds like a cool idea. I think like achievements is definitely one of those like major Wrath features that everybody's really excited about, and we're really happy to be able to bring back to people. So I think it would make sense if we try to find some way to work those out.
If I could just quickly segue the same question, do you feel there might be any modern players who would be sad that there's new achievements they can't get?
Yes.
Does that give them a reason to come back to play Classic then?
I think so. I think there's we do want to be a little bit careful, but at the same time we don't want to like handcuff ourselves. We are trying to create the original experience, and we don't want to go too crazy and make things feel completely unlike they were originally. But at the same time, like, if you're talking about adding a new harder difficulty of a dungeon and adding new achievements for that and doing that in Wrath of the Lich King, that feels pretty thematically on brand for Wrath of the Lich King. So while you might be sad if you're playing a modern World of Warcraft and you really want to get that particular achievement, I mean, the achievement scores are kept separately. So if you're comparing yourself to other modern players, you're on a level playing field. And if you're comparing your classic achievements to other classic players, you're on a level playing field. So you might be sad, but at the same time, you can do that. You can do it for the same subscription. They're really both the same game. There's nothing really stopping you from doing that. It's just that somebody else chose to do a thing that you haven't chosen to do yet.
Okay, so I can't believe I'm going to say this word out loud. There has been lots of threads recently on clam weaving. I can't believe I've just said that. We know,
it got me.
But what we want to know is it difficult to determine what is a clever use of game mechanic and what is an exploit? We saw grouping and leaving, for example, recently, and I saw a tweet you put out about that. Is that a challenge? How do you decide where to draw the line on people being very intelligent and breaking your game and people fishing and Zangarmarsh for the same item over and over and over and over for 14k experience?
So it is a challenge sometimes because it's a really funny thing about rule systems and what kind of things are explicitly spelled out and what things are kind of implicitly understood by players. And so I was thinking about this on this particular topic about the grouping and leaving inside dungeon instances. And it's you can imagine that if you were doing a foot race with your friends at school, you all understand that none of you are allowed to use bicycles, skateboards, etc., right? But nobody writes it down. You just go, let's go race over to the light post or whatever, and you run, and everybody knows that's how the race works. But if you get to professional racing, they have to start writing it down, right? They have to say no, you can't get on any wheeled vehicles and such, and start spelling out the exact guidelines. And so when we're looking at some kind of electronic race like this, some of those guidelines are assumed by the people because they're enforced, logistically in the code, right? So they're very clearly spelled out in the code, right? Okay, you can't teleport to Northrend. Why not? Because you have to ride a boat. The game doesn't let you teleport, right? That's just right in there. But at the same time, then people will say well, the game didn't stop me from doing this, so it's okay, right? And it's well, no, that's a bug, right? It's supposed to stop you. And there's that conversation, right? Trying to figure out was it supposed to stop you, and should it be obvious that you knew that? And so generally we try to err on the side of, if it's really obvious, right, that you knew what you were doing, then we will call that wrong. And if it's not, then we will just try to change it to prevent it. And so actually the grouping one is a good example where when we were talking about it, we actually thought that it was buttoned up until recently last week we were talking about it again. We were wait, did anyone ever check that? What is happening to regroup and tap? People have been talking about it. We checked it, right? And I'm oh, right, it actually works. Yeah, we're well, what do we do to prevent it? Because it definitely seems like it was unfair. We called it unfair back in 2008, right? So, and definitely it feels like that there's that implicit rule with a dungeon instance, right, that you're all supposed to be in the same party. And that's kind of illustrated pretty clearly by, if you leave the party, it teleports you out. And there's a grace period for I accidentally quit the group and I want to rejoin so I don't get teleported out. And then during that grace period, you can manipulate the experience formula as if you weren't in a party. And that's one of those things where it's a really good example of you're over the line here, right? Clearly the rules were painting a box where you were supposed to be in the party, and you can see that from the message, but we relaxed them to kind of allow this grace period, and there's a manipulation there. So what we're probably going to do long term, this is what we talked about, is what we think we would like is to have the experience automatically split between everybody who's in the instance. We want to make sure we take time to think about what the consequences of doing it that way would be, rather than doing it by party, which is how it's worked for years. But that's what we think really is the intent, right? Everybody who's in the dungeon is supposed to be in the same party. So for things like experience eligibility, we should do the same thing, where we treat you as if you're in the party, even if you're not. Today, we have the fix that we could do quickly, which was, we already have a threshold for an amount of damage you have to do on a creature before we give you full experience. And that's to kind of cover things like, I kite it over to the guards, or I just let the guards kill it for me and I just tap it, and the guards are doing all the real work for me, or things like that. Or two people trying to mob snipe each other out in the world. If you're trying to steal the tap, you want to feel like whoever got the tap doesn't have to do 100% of the experience, but they shouldn't just be able to tap it and run away. and feel like that's the right strategy. They should actually have to engage it too. So 40% is what we kind of settled on that. And we've had that since Burning Crusade Classic.
Yeah.
And we liked that, and we said, hey, since that system has been in, it's tested, it works well, what if we just turn that up to 95 in dungeons? So in a dungeon, if you get 95% of the damage, right, then you get full experience. That's your party gets 95% of the damage. So in almost all cases, this is not going to bother normal dungeon groups. The only case where this comes up, and we've seen some talk about this, is if creatures do damage to themselves. Yes. So I think there's a spell called Cauterize in Utgard Keep that people have been talking a lot about. Mm-hmm. We were also worried about, like, one of the bosses, I think, drops a sword on her head and does damage to her. We're not sure whether that damage is counted as from the players or from her. So we were looking at those kind of things. That's why we put it to, like, we wanted to, first of all, make sure that we weren't going to break loot, and it doesn't. So, like, even if you've tapped it at all, you still get the loot. So we don't have to worry about, like, you're skipping boss loot. And then, but then that 95% threshold feels like, okay, you're generally going to get that. It's not going to be a real problem for most cases, except for people on the very, very fringes of trying to do something really, you know, spicy. But it's going to really cut down that I'm going to drop out of the group, because now you're going to tap the mob. You have to do 95% of the damage, then rejoin the group when they finish it for you. And was that actually efficient at this point? Like, not really. Like, you probably should have had them help you, right? Yeah. If they help you, you're going to get 20% of it and be able to go full speed instead of having to go, you know, like basically 1/5 speed or maybe a quarter speed if, you know, one of them's a healer, right? But like 1/4 speed to get, you know, the full experience. Or if you don't get it, it rapidly falls off. If you have lower than the expected threshold, it falls off at the cube of the ratio of what damage you did to the damage threshold. So really fast.
I've been out of school for a long time. We can't use cubes and ratios here, Brian. Jeez.
It's I can help a little bit. I can give you an example. I did post this on Twitter too, but it was like the outdoor threshold is a good one to use. It's like 40%. We expect you to do 40% of the damage to the mob, right? So let's say you did 20% of the damage to the mob, right? Yep. You do 20% of its health, and we go, oh, well, what's 20%? That's half of what we expected you to do. We expected you to do 40, you did 20. So the ratio is, you know, 1 to 2, right? Yeah. It's half. And so that's 0.5. Okay. So we cube that. 0.5 times 0.5 is 0.25 times 0.5 is 0.12. So 12%. You do 20% of the mob's health, we give you 12% of the experience. So any math nerds can follow along with that.
Software developers, am I right?
The short version is it drops off real fast.
Yeah, Okay, I can't believe I'm going to ask this. This is something my producer is making me say. Oh dear. Brian, off topic. We here at Method love vegetables.
Vegetables?
Our favourite is a leek. Do you have any features in the classic version of Wrath of the Lich King that have not been announced? Maybe a tidbit you can give us? Just a little leak here for everyone at Method?
I don't think so. I feel like I've already given you a lot with the possible heroic pluses, and maybe we'll move 10-man gear to the heroic pluses and make the 10-mans drop 25-person loot. Again, just for anybody tuning in right now, for the previous tier, so the current tier will be left alone. And so I don't know if there's anything else that I can really
That's
think
good.
of that we haven't announced already.
Very happy. So. Next question, number 11. Kat, I'm going to let you ask this one because I think I may have yours.
That's all right. So, Brian, do you feel pressure going into the expansion with many veteran players argue what's best? That doesn't make any sense to me.
No, it doesn't. Do you feel any pressure going into the expansion that is considered by many to be the best? Do you feel pressure recapturing that?
Yeah, is it hard to feel like you're giving the same amount of joy to the veteran players that you had originally?
I mean, I think it's always a challenge, right? We're always really concerned about how people are reacting to it, and we're aware of the fact that you can never make everybody happy all the time, right? And so there's always going to be things that reasonable people disagree on. Like Dungeon Finder is a great example, right? There are reasonable people with reasonable arguments that say we should put in random Dungeon Finder, and reasonable people with reasonable arguments that say we shouldn't. And we have to pick one, right? We can either put it in or not. And so it is a challenge to try to navigate that, that feeling of nostalgia, that feeling of excitement, and this has been true since the beginning. There's things even in original Classic that we were trying to make sure we were striking that right balance between I remember that it used to work this way, I remember using this trick I remember using this exploit, right? And we go, well, we're going to fix it. And it's like, there are these things that we have to do to try to make sure that we're, preserving a sense of a game that is appropriate for today, if that makes sense. Make sure that we're serving today's audience, and today's audience is different than the audience from back then. They're more experienced. They've been doing this for longer, so they're better at the game than they used to be.
Yeah, just a little. I was kidding, Raph. Pat, I'm gonna let you go next because this is another big one, I'm afraid, Brian.
Yeah, this is a big one, and it's really important for so many people's futures. What happens after Wrath Classic?
We don't know yet, but something. We got a long road with Wrath, of course. The thing that we're really looking forward to right now, of course, is Ulduar, and then after that, Trial of the Crusader, and then Icecrown Citadel, and even Ruby Sanctum. And so there's so much coming for Wrath of the Lich King. We do have time to decide, but we are really interested in hearing what people's ideas are and thoughts are early, so that we can make those decisions. That's why we're sent out that survey recently. Is we want to get the feedback and the conversation going now, because we want to make sure that we're delivering what players are expecting and what they want. And it kind of goes back to your last question, right? There's lots of different things that we could do, and what do players want? There's going to be differences of opinion. Which ones make sense for us to build? And so we want to have that conversation with the community and internally, and make sure that we are getting lots of diverse voices, and then make a plan that hopefully will excite people.
So my next question is, going into further phases of Wrath Classic, can we expect... Obviously, I'm seeing a lot. The cadence and the timing has changed, where we do move slightly quicker, and I'm seeing a lot of questions specifically about legendary acquisitions. Is there any plans to change that? And also, are there any other changes that you expect to be challenged with down the line due to the different cadence of Wrath Classic?
That's a good question. I think we did see some of that challenge already in Burning Crusade, where, when we had closer arena seasons that were a little bit shorter than the original ones, we wanted to increase the rate that players got arena points so that they could buy their gear more quickly. And so we are willing to make adjustments to things if they're based around timing and things like that. And one of the things we also paid attention to when we were doing the original Burning Crusade release was, how long is it going to take people to farm Atiyesh? Let's make sure that it makes sense that you're going to be able to get at least one, and maybe that it's a challenge to get two. And so we did do some of that math and try to figure out if it made sense. And where there's a little bit of a balancing from both sides, we don't want to make a lot of design changes, so where does that put us on the calendar? And there are other things going on the calendar all the time, right? We're just, time is moving, there's other games being released, Dragonflight coming up, and so we got lots of exciting things going on. So we try to plan with the calendar, where does it fit? Where can we put this thing, right? And so there's always a little bit of pressure from both sides about how we want to adjust it. So when we can, we want to do it without making any adjustments to the game and have that land at an appropriate time. And if we have to, because things do feel compressed for some reason, we will make adjustments as necessary.
And we're seeing a lot of people ask, of course, with 25-man loot being moved down to the 10-man, will that also affect legendary acquisition?
That's a good question. We haven't actually decided for a legendary acquisition. We've gone back and forth on that a couple times. A lot of this is all really tied together. What we ultimately are aiming for is we want it to feel like if you're a 10-player guild and you just do 10-player raids, you feel like there is a supported, exciting experience. Yeah. And if you're a 25-player guild and there's 25-player raids, we want you to feel like, okay, that's worth the additional effort, because we know there's a logistical hurdle, right? That you have to come, it's easier to get 10 people together than it is to get 25 people together. We know that. And so the philosophy at the time of Wrath of the Lich King was that 25-player raid should give you better rewards. And so when it's the current tier, we want to make sure that it does something that's extra. When it's a previous tier, maybe not. Does that include legendaries? I'm not sure. But we do want to make sure that there's always a little bit of an edge for doing 25s.
So my next question, of course, is the API. The Classic API at the moment is relatively closed off. Now, I work for Raider.io, and we love a leaderboard. Is there any chance with Heroic Plus, we did ask about leaderboards, that you open that up to external creators to be able to create tools and things like that? Is that something that's been considered?
What specifically? I think I know what you're talking about, but I want to know specifically. You're looking for leaderboards of things like...
Yeah, so I think specifically, it's hard to come up with, because this is all very new, but being able to maybe track speed runs and things like that. The API at the moment obviously lets us track how quick everything happens with dungeons, and Mythic Plus especially. There's so much information, and with Heroic Plus possibly looking, not the same, but of a similar vein, is there ways we have to track maybe the speed for the speed runners who want to do classic mode-esque, I guess?
And are you thinking like the things that we do right now where you can like print out the combat logs and things like that and upload those? Those are insufficient?
I believe so. I'm not entirely so. I'm not a technical man. I make silly jokes on the internet.
And I'll be honest, it's not like my exact area of expertise either. Okay. But I do know that there are people who work with the logging websites like Warcraft Logs and try to make sure that we are trying to answer some of the requests, but we can't always get to them, and that's the reality of development. Is right. We're always trying to balance multiple things. I do know that we export like arena team rankings and things like that, so third-party websites can make use of those. And I know that we're still supporting, of course, the log dumping that you can do from your combat log, so you can upload those to other logging websites. So beyond that, I'm not sure exactly. Okay, but we'd be willing to entertain it. That said, I do want to point out a kind of a counter case for it, just in case there's people wondering about like, what about how come I can't the armory is a great example, right? Like, why can't I go look up my character on the armory? And we're not 100% opposed to that, but there is the argument from some people like, hey, as soon as players start showing up on the armory, it starts putting a lot more like gatekeeping into the system, where like you start to look up like, well, what have they done? What have they done in their raids? Exactly, yeah, what's their gear score? And like, should I bother inviting them? And we don't like that aspect because it kind of runs counter to that social exploration, that kind of like organic group formation. We kind of want you to have that conversation with the person, like ask them if they went to the raids or not. Let them tell you, because it's very possible, like one of the things that we see that is unfortunate from the use of Armory for that kind of behavior is they go and look up your character and it's like, I'm on an alt, I've done all these raids. Yeah. And so they think like, oh yeah, this guy, he has no idea what's going on, right? But if they just asked, right, it would be like, oh yeah, no, I've done them all. I know exactly what I'm doing. Like, this is an alt. Right. So that's what we would like to do, is have people really having conversations and working together with each other.
So we're coming to the end of our time with you today, Brian, and I cannot thank you enough. But I don't want to end with I don't want to drill you with any more intense questions and pick your brain. What I want to know, Brian, is what are your favorite memories of Wrath of the Lich King?
Oh my gosh, my favorite memory is probably making my Death Knight. I think making my Death Knight was the favorite, partly because my original character in World of Warcraft, I wanted to make a Death Knight, but they didn't exist. And so I did the closest thing you could to a Death Knight, which was an undead warrior. So I made an undead warrior. I've been an undead warrior for years. And then when I remember, this is actually a development memory, was I remember they were coming around trying to figure out what the new class should be in Wrath of the Lich King, and there were like 3 choices, and one of them was Death Knight, and I was like, it has to be Death Knight. Like, please, you do Death Knight, and I will switch characters immediately. I'm going to change maids. That will be my main forever, and it was my main forever in Modern at that point. I've branched out a little bit now, going back to Classic, but until then, I was playing a Death Knight nonstop. So that's probably my favorite experience, is that starting zone, that cool experience.
It is great.
Leveling up and tanking.
Do you have a boss in a raid you're excited to see again?
Oh, so many. I think XT is one of my favorite in terms of like amusing like behavior, right? Like this kid
doesn't been that way.
Yes. I have a lot of personal memories of children throwing temper tantrums now. so it's pretty fun.
For me, I have to go Marrogar, because I just need Bone Storm to be yelled at me. I still use an add-on to this day that says it when I play a warrior, and I Blade Storm. So, I mean, I'd love to hear Twitch chats as well. I'd love to hear all your favorite memories, and I'm sure Brian would like to see them. With that being said, Brian, I would like to say, do you have any final thoughts, any advice for those venturing into Northrend for the first time, maybe ever? Anything you'd like to say, and of course, if you could let people know where they can find and bother you as we have today.
I guess the biggest piece of advice I would say is really try to like do what you feel comfortable doing. Don't let anybody else tell you how to play World of Warcraft. There's so many different ways to play World of Warcraft, from people who are going to be racing to World First 80 to me, who I'm a notoriously slow leveler. I hit level 60 in Classic until my guild was in Blackwing Lair, and I joined them then. It is okay. You can play World of Warcraft the way you want to. There's lots of different ways to do it, so please do.
And where can people find you in order to thank you for giving us this time and to bother you with
I'm on the WoW forums, and I'm also on Twitter at Brian Birmingham, I think it is, or something like that.
You can see it underneath you right now.
Oh yeah, there it is. That's right there. Yeah. So Brian Birmingham. It's not my full name, but that's what fits.
It's close enough. Brian, there's one thing I want to say to you, and that's from meeting you today. And we hadn't met. We hadn't spoken before this ever. It's quite clear that your love for World of Warcraft it's infectious. You've made me so excited. And it's been an absolute honor and a pleasure to sit here and listen to you talk about something you care about so deeply, because that's what we all do. We love World of Warcraft, and when we ask these questions and when we annoy you, it's because of that love. So thank you so much from me and Pat, I'm sure, as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel it. I do. I always say that, like, when people are really passionate about us, even if they're angry, right, it's because they love the game. It's because they care.
Correct,
that's the best gift that anybody in the community can give us. So thank you all.
Thank you. Brian, we're going to let you go. Good luck. I'm sure you're going to need it. I have no idea how many people are in the queue right now, but it's a couple.
Probably a lot.
Yeah, it's a couple, and I'll be in there with them when I finish at 1 a.m. So,
big shout out to our amazing live operations team who is managing that right now, and they're the best.
Definitely. Brian, good night, good day.
Thank you so much.
Good luck, and we'll see you
Good
guys
luck.
soon.
All right, thanks so much.
Bye.
Now, Kat.
That was awesome.
I think he's my favorite human on the planet.
I don't think I've seen a smile that big in quite some time.
I know. I don't love anybody except my cat that much, and I don't even know what he is. So yeah, that was incredible. A lot of really interesting news there, especially with Heroic Plus and things like that coming soon. And what that could
New achievements
be
potentially sounds like a
this is-
definitely a yes.